Let's start with the Constitution. What we have here on slide one is, of course, beginning of the U.S. Constitution, right? It's important because it actually tells us what a constitution is all about, right? Our own Constitution was debated over and thought about and deliberated over by our founding fathers before it was written, and so when they wrote it, they actually shared their perspective about where they were going with this new experiment, and so they tell us, right? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, right, a union of the states, are driven basically by the following goals: to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves, our posterity, kids, right? Those that come after, to ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. So this Constitution, right, has a list of goals that it's supposed to meet for us, things that it's supposed to deliver, right? They're very clear, just laying them out here for us, right? Justice, peace, right? Defense, the welfare for the general public, and then liberty, right? Those are the goals, right? And then to have all of those goals last into the future. So that's what is driving them to write a constitution. And it's interesting, right? What they're thinking here, of course, is that they're going to write a document, and this document's going to be, right, the guide, the rule book of what this country is going to do going forward. When we look at constitutions in general, not just ours, but state constitutions, other countries' constitutions, we see a lot of these same goals and ideas. And what we know from them is that when a group of people that are organizing their country write a constitution, what they have in mind is providing a baseline set of rules, right, that we're going to be in play for that government and that country, and then those people that are citizens of that country. And so constitutions are generally, regardless of when they're written, whether they're a first constitution as a country coming together for the first time, or a constitution, a second or third or fourth constitution, when a constitution is put together and is legitimately ratified as the document that's going to guide a government and a country, it is, right, at that point, the most basic or fundamental law, right, of that country, that institution. So in other words, when you have a constitution, it is, right, the beginning. And then everything that comes after that in that country or that state or that organization, because we have constitutions and all of those things, all of the things that are done after the fact should be resting on that constitution and resting on the principles and the rules and the goals of that constitution. So it should be, right, the place that you go to figure out, can the government do this? Should the government do this? Is there some way to understand that what the government's doing now is correct or incorrect, right? And constitutions are the place that you will start with that. So when you wrap it all up in a sense, and you think, this is all about politics and how government is run by politics, well, the Constitution is your rule set, right, that tells you how to play the game of politics in this arena, the US government. And all constitutions are kind of that way, right? They're a set of rule books. They're a set of rules for how to play the game. And they're important because they're identifying the right way to play the game and the way to win with legitimacy on your side, with the law on your side. So constitutions are laying that out. I like to draw a little bit of analogy, if you're a board game player, you have to sit down before you try to play a game. You have to read the rules to figure out how you're going to play it. For those of you that have ever played like Monopoly, you know that you play by the rules at your house. And then every time you go over to somebody else's house, they're playing by a different set of rules, and you don't understand why. And it's because they've read those rules or not. But if they have, they've read them and maybe read them differently and interpreted them differently, and they play the game a little differently, right? I remember I played for years and years and years, and I'd originally learned to play the game from, talking with other people that had played it. They said, "Hey, let's play this. Here's how you do it." And so we played. And the way we played the game when I sat down and read the rules was completely wrong, right? We always, and I bet a lot of y'all play the same way that we did. That's incorrect, right? You play the game, Monopoly, you roll your dice, you make your move, you land on a piece of property, you decide whether you want to buy it or not. And the way we played it is if you didn't buy it, then the next person rolled the dice and they made their moves and made their decisions. But if you read the rule book, you'll understand that if you don't, as a player, land on the Monopoly square and decide not to buy it, the bank then is supposed to auction it off to one of the other players, which changes the whole game, right? So reading the rules, right, will give you a good vision about how you're supposed to play the game. And that's what constitutions do for us, right? They lay those rules out. They tell us how to play the game. Our Constitution in particular, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level, tend to do three things for us. And if you look at our Constitution, and we will in a little bit, the first thing that our Constitution does is it creates the political institutions, right? So in other words, it creates all the actors in government. After it does that, it tells you what powers, abilities those institutions have. And then after it's created all the players of government, it puts limitations or obligations on government and how it affects citizens, either that it provides guarantees from the government for citizens, or it provides guarantees for citizens that the government must provide. So, and we call those either rights or liberties. So those three things, those are purposes that when we look right at a constitution, we're going to find. And so let's look at a little bit here, right? This is this part right here is an excerpt from our Constitution, right? And it says, all legislative powers, in other words, the powers to make laws, are herein granted, are vested in a Congress. So that's telling you right here that the Constitution is creating this institution called a Congress, and its power is legislative. And then it tells you that Congress is going to consist of a Senate and a House. So now we know that, right, from the Constitution, right, it's doing two of these three things here. It's saying we're going to create a part of government called Congress, made up of one half being the Senate and one half being the House of Representatives. And this Congress, with its two parts, job is to make laws. Right, so it's right. That's exactly what it's doing for us, right? And you'll see this throughout the Constitution, right? As you look at it, right here, it goes on a little further to talk about the actual Senate, right? One half of that Congress, and about the people in the Senate and what their powers are going to be, what they're supposed to do, right? So the Senate shall choose their other officers, right? So they're going to choose people to be in charge of running the Senate, and also a president pro tem, who in the absence of the vice president, or when he shall exercise the office of the president. So there's going to be this one person in charge of the Senate, and it's the vice president of the United States. But if he's not there because he's exercising the office of the president, then they'll have other officers to run the Senate. And if we look at the Senate at the federal level today, that's still true, right? It still happens. Vice President Pence is known as, and in one of his other titles, the President of the Senate. Now, for most normal workings in the Senate, Vice President Pence is never there, is not doing anything. About the only time you're going to see the Vice President occupying his office as President of the Senate is when he's needed to break a tie vote. And so, most of the time, 99% of the time, the Senate is under a president pro tem, someone that's standing in his place. But the Constitution lays that out right at the beginning, right? So it's telling us there's this legislature is going to be made up of the House and the Senate, and here's some of the rules about how the Senate works. For purpose 3, I've pulled up here the First Amendment to the Constitution, right? The First Amendment is arguably the most important amendment that we have, or change we have to the Constitution, which is why it's the First Amendment. And it is serving purpose 3, which is to preserve or guarantee some power to the people, right? And it tells us Congress, right, this thing we just talked about that the Constitution created, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibition of free exercise, abridging freedom of speech, press, right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So if you go back, to the previous slide, right, between these two excerpts, you can see our Constitution doing these 3 things, right? Creating a political institution, giving some powers to it to create legislation, but then in the First Amendment, coming back and putting in guarantees for the citizens by limiting those legislative powers that they just talked about belonging to the Congress, right? The First Amendment serves as a limitation on government power. Congress's job is to make law, but not in these areas, right? So our Constitution is laid out in an interesting way that it builds all of it up. And then here, this is the First Amendment, right? So this means the Constitution was voted into place, it's out there, it's working, and then this is the first major change, right? Actually voted upon change to the Constitution because this wasn't present in the beginning. But that's what the amendments do, right? Is alter that Constitution to have more clarity, to add something, remove something, to change the way we're assigning powers to the government and fulfilling some of those purposes that we laid out at the beginning. Does that make sense to everybody, right? How the purposes of a Constitution and how these are true regardless of where you're looking, whether it's at the federal level. If you looked at Texas, they have their own Constitution, does the same things about Texas government. If you create a new organization, most of the time you're going to sit down the founding members of that organization and create a document that lays out how it's going to work, right? You may or may not call it a Constitution, but it's doing the same, fulfilling the same purposes. Yes, that makes sense? Thank you. Okay, so knowing that that's the purpose of a Constitution, is to put all these pieces together and tell them how they're going to work, you have to understand that when someone is creating a document like this, that's going to create a government and it's going to say how the government's going to work, they have in mind as a group what they think is the best way to do things. It's never the only way to do things. They could write a Constitution a different way with different players and different powers and different emphasis on how things are going to work. But when a group of people decide to write a Constitution or a set of rules for playing a game, right, they're writing it the way they want to see it exercised. Means there's probably going to be other people who don't want it that way, who aren't happy with it, who see it as the wrong way to do things. So at the very point that you start creating and building a document that says, here's how we're going to do things, and you're putting that in writing and you're going to ratify that and put it into place, there are going to be other players that want to be involved that are looking at that saying, this isn't good, this isn't right, this isn't fair. And they're correct. Constitutions are not documents that guarantee fairness to all people. They are documents that put a government into place or a ruling group into place and tell you the rules they're going to follow, and that as long as those rules are followed, we will consider it fair or legitimate, right? But those people that don't like it or voted against it and feel like they got ignored are probably not going to be happy, and are going to tell us how biased and crooked and wrong that document is and what needs to be changed about it. And that's not ever going to be any different, right? All constitutions, because you're writing down how you're going to do something, and which by definition means you're saying anything we're not talking about here, we're not doing, is putting bias into the system. It's a bias to those rules. It's a bias to playing the game that way. And if you, as someone that wants to get involved in that political game, don't want to play by those rules, you're probably not going to get any impact behind your actions. You're probably not going to be able to win, because the very first thing the folks in the system are going to look at you and say is, well, that's not how we do this. You've got to do it this way. So go do it that way and come back to us, and maybe we'll pay attention to you. So when we write a constitution, we're putting in a set of rules that are going to be biased against some, are going to be seen as fair and proper by others, the majority in that situation. Those rules we put into place may limit who can be involved in the situation, in the discussion, who can play the game. We're going to write bias into every document that we construct. Not with an intention of saying we want to ostracize people necessarily, although sometimes we do. But when you decide to play the game and you say, here's how we're playing it, then you're biasing that against other ways to play it. Before I move to that, let me give you an example. In the original Constitution, before we made any amendments to it, who would be considered a citizen under the original US Constitution? This is an opportunity to exercise your typing skills or to turn on your microphone and give an answer. Okay, Lauren comes back with white men who owned land. That's absolutely true. You were born in America. That is also true going forward, right? Not all of them were at the time, but we are now, right? So these are both good. Anything else? White men who owned land. Does that mean if you were white and weren't a landowner that you couldn't vote? It did, right? I mean, so it's white, and there's another piece in there. White free land owning males generally are the ones that were. That's a pretty small group of people when you look at everybody that was here. And so when that's set out as your base level for participation in the system, you've written a pretty biased document right from the beginning, right? Well over 65, 70% of the population of what would become the United States are prevented from having any say in how that government's going to run when we started this. Now, at the time, right, the guys writing this weren't particularly focused on who they were excluding. They were kind of just following what was understood to be the norm of the day for who gets involved in government, right? And how you defined a citizen. There weren't just a whole lot of debates about the definition of citizenship among these folks. Now, today we look at it and go, wow, right? A lot of bias there, not really fair. A whole lot of people excluded from this. But you got to remember, right, that we didn't, in legislation or in constitutional amendments, change all of this to become as inclusive as we are, although we still face challenges, to be inclusive as we are until actually the 1960s, right? By the time you get through all the legislation, and we still have challenges about who gets to play in the game fairly or not. If you're going to look just at constitutional amendments, 1920, right, is the last constitutional amendment that is incorporating new groups of people into the yes, you can play the game and vote, which is still only 100 years ago, right? So while if you'd ask a founding father, this seems to be a really restrictive definition of who a citizen is, they'd have looked at you real funny at the time and go, this is what all countries do. This is normal. This isn't out of bounds. In the couple hundred years since then, we've obviously changed a lot. But when you write that Constitution, when you write that set of rules, it's going to be biased in time, place, and manner of where you're looking at it and what you think is important. And as it wears on through time and through history, those biases are probably going to become a lot clearer. And you'll judge that institution or that country by how it tries to resolve those as time goes on. Do we still have biases in our Constitution about who can play the game? The answer is most definitely. We still have very strong biases in place. If you are under the age of 18, you don't get to play, right? You can't vote. If you're under the age of 25, you can't run for national office. If you're under the age of 35, you can't run for president, right? So these are biases as well, age biases. We could call it age discrimination if we wanted to. Do we think that they're incorrect or wrong or unfair and should be changed? Most of the time we don't, right? We think we've got good reasons for putting that bias in place. We think that until you've reached the age of adulthood legally, which is 18 in most instances, then you don't have a say or a vote in what the country's policy and policymakers are. That until you're 35 or older, you probably don't have the wisdom and experience to be a president of the United States. I know the older that I've gotten, the more I would like to raise those ages, right? I'm bringing that bias along with me. As I went past 25 and thought about, I could be in the Senate, I'm like, the House, I'm like, no, I'm not nearly adult enough. And 35 at president, please. Right at 35, I was still trying to figure out who I was. And so those are problems, right, that we still have. Charles here says, so the laws of our founding fathers were not much different than the laws of King George. They really weren't. They were bringing their own history along with them. So that's their own experiences in history. And so that's a good observation, I think. All they were trying to do in the biggest sense was substitute King George out of the way, because that's where they thought a majority of their problems rested. That and that the House of Lords and Commons didn't let them have the say they were supposed to have. At least they felt they weren't getting the say they were supposed to have through their representatives in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So, yes, absolutely. And we've held on to a lot of that, right? Now we're our government is a government of debate and argument and hopefully some compromise and reconciliation to come to a conclusion. And our leaders, right, are those that we choose. But once they're there, right, they're the ones that really control a lot of what's going on. So yeah, there's still a lot of that. I wouldn't say king or monarchy, I can't even say the word, monarchical influence. But you see a lot of people not so happy with decisions of government and knowing that they've got to wait a few years to have a chance to change it. So it's a slow moving process. Now that's a big difference, right? We at least do have the opportunity to get involved and make a change over time. Not so much easily in the English system at the time, right? You either had to force the king to change his mind or force the king out. So now, if you could get the House of Lords and to all kind of be on the same side, that might convince the king to change their position, but not necessarily. But yeah, so there we are, right? The constitutional biases that are there, though, right? And they're in every constitution you're going to look at. And so when you're reading them, you need to be kind of, right, paying attention to the fact that these are a set of rules that the players of the game at that time wrote to put into place that would, right, advantage them. You think that as one of the elite group of our founding fathers, you would write into law, into Constitution, a set of rules or regulations or practices that were going to put you at a disadvantage? Not if you could help it, right? And so they didn't. They were certainly writing the rules to benefit what they all thought was the best plan going forward, but a plan that also was in their benefit. Not too astounding that people are following human nature and looking after ourselves. Kind of brings us to the idea of talking about how it is we had founding fathers that were interested in starting a government. And so we need to talk about why they were pushing for independence and how they thought they could make themselves independent from the monarchy. That in itself is kind of a big shift in thought to go from subject of a sovereign, right, to citizen leader of a country, right? And so we need to talk a little bit about the notion of revolution and how right, they could come to this perspective of changing things. And there's two political philosophers that were writing prior to our founding fathers pushing for revolution that had a profound influence on how potential leaders were looking at the world and why they thought government was useful and how they thought government came about. The first is a political philosopher named Thomas Hobbs. He's a natural rights philosopher, English, a teacher, an instructor, private instructor for the royalty in England at the time. And he wrote a book called The Leviathan, among other things. And the Leviathan for him was his treatise on how it is we have society and government rather than having nothing at all. Because, right, if we go back in time and we think about this, right, we're living under, in his time, this monarchy, and we've got all of these rules in the society and economy, and there's, literature and arts and laws and, commerce, and all of this is, right, a very regulated, organized society, and it seems kind of, right, begging the question of how did we get here? And so he undertakes trying to do a thought experiment about how you end up with a society like this that's organized and has these regulations. And he says, so let's look historically, let's go backwards, let's try to figure out what happened. And as a natural rights philosopher, he's got a belief that humans have some inherent worth. Humans have rights that belong to them because they're humans, right? So he's going to argue that there are rights inherent to man. And the base, most fundamental right that we have is the right to uh, self-defense, right? If you take everything else away, all the laws, you take away all of the structure of society, you take away monarchies, you try to get back to the time before society, uh, there's still things there that exist that we could call laws, that we would call, the law of nature, where the strongest survive, right? And he recognizes that and says all of us have the right to try to preserve ourselves uh, in a instance of force or aggression against us. At no time are you going to hear somebody probably argue that no, you can't defend yourself, right? You just got to take it. Um, they might write that into a law somewhere, but if you come to take somebody's life, they're probably going to fight to keep it. And he says he thinks that this is a natural right that's inherent to man, that we be able to protect our lives, look after ourselves. He says if you go back to what he calls the state of nature, the time before society, there are no rules, there's no laws, there's just people. This would be the dominant thing that's kind of controlling the interaction between people, right? Is that you're going to be wary of everyone because there are no laws to help guide behavior. It's other than right, might makes right. And if someone tries to exercise their might over me, it's my right to try to fight back and protect myself and my life. And if in the exercise of that I kill them, it's not, it's not a problem, right? It's what had to happen. Now, that sounds like a very chaotic, ugly kind of existence, the state of nature, right? It's a kind of like from the story, being on the deserted island, the kids on the deserted island, Lord of the Flies kind of thing, right? And it holds this kind of real barbaric allure to us, right? I mean, we like to watch Survivor and Naked and Afraid, and all these go back and be people outside of society and see how you do. And so I think Hobbes was kind of doing a little bit of that himself, thinking about, well, this is probably what it was like before there was society and government. And I'm going to skip a slide ahead because I think, I have his description of how he thinks the world was before society. He tells us that in the state of nature, men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention furnish them withal. In other words, in the state of nature, in this time before society, you get by if you're strong or maybe you're smart. And if you're both, great, right? Your own invention and your own strength. In that condition, in other words, this place where there's no society, there is no place for industry, there's no culture, there's no knowledge of the earth, no time, no arts, no letters, no society. And which is worst of all, there is a continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? That's his description of the state of nature. It doesn't sound like a place I want to be. And we don't actually know if it was ever really, really like this, where it's one person against one person all the time, right? If we look to the sociological and historical records of man, most of the time we're seeing people in groups, right? Familial groups, tribal groups. But even in that, where there might be some of this society starting to develop, it's still pretty brutish, still pretty harsh. Might makes right is still kind of the principle that's making a lot of things work. And it's slowly out of time that we come out of that. What Hobbes theorizes brings us out of that is an exercise in rationality on the part of man. The fact that we are rational animals, that we sit down and we look at the situation and go, we can do better. And what he has in mind is what we call the social contract, that people of reason will come together and say, look, we can work together and do a lot better than if we're always competing against one another. If you'll agree not to slam me in the back of the head with a rock when I'm doing something else, right? Maybe I can get something done that'll benefit both of us. Or if you don't hit me, I won't hit you, and we can both go on our way. I like to look at it as an interaction, right, among the bounties of nature, right? I say there's an apple tree that's laden with apples, and I'm looking at it thinking, that's it, man. I've got food for the next couple weeks. And you're on the other side of the tree looking at it thinking the same thing. So we've got some options here, right? We can get over the tree and who gets the apples. We could maybe learn to share. Maybe we could inventory each other's abilities and come up with a real nice substitution or division of labor and make it easier on both of us. I might be a great tree climber. You might be a really strong fighter. And I can say, hey, if you'll keep everybody off my back, I'll climb the tree and get apples for both of us. Right? That's the kind of thing that he thinks has happened, that we exercise our reason and our rationality, and we contract with one another. We come together in an agreement of how we're going to act with one another. And that's the creation of society. That contract of how we're going to act creates society that we can all do better and live better. He uses a phrase that this act of creating a social contract creates the Leviathan, right? For historical purposes, the Leviathan was defined as some great creature. And on the front of his book, when he wrote it, was a king, a monarch, and the body of the monarch was made up of all of the citizens of society, and then the monarch is the head of that society. So he's calling that creation, right, that kind of Frankenstein's monster of society, the Leviathan, a great beast. You look in the Bible, it refers to the Leviathan. It's talking about the great beast of the ocean, the whales, or the Leviathans. And so this is a great beast too, a social construct where people could come together and put rules into place and do better than before when they were in this state of nature. So it's a right. This was a huge monumental kind of work. It was a bestseller. The Leviathan was, because in a sense it was given a rational explanation of why there was society instead of none at all, and why there are rulers instead of just chaos, and why we should be happy that we're in a situation where these rules and regulations guide our everyday lives and let us do better than in a time before society. Now, the problem for Hobbes is that as he wrote this, his justification for society is that we as rational individuals come together and create this, and we have this contract. And contractual law had been up and running for over a century as the defining economic characteristic. In England, we had the great trading companies, right, going around the world establishing contracts between companies and other countries, and all this trading is going on. And one of the defining characteristics of a contract is there are obligations put on both sides of the contract, right? I'll do this, you'll do this, we'll both be better off. But there were also, right, rules in place of if one of the parties broke the contract, about, my obligations, if you break the contract, are now null and void, and I can back out and go do something else and maybe take you to court and try to get some kind of claim or something like that. And so Hobbes has just basically made a contractual argument about the creation of society and the creation of government. And while this made a lot of sense at the time, that's being written and people are reading it and going, wow, this is interesting. The monarch didn't see it that way. because what Hobbs had just done was said that if the king doesn't live up to their end of the contract, people have a right to revolt. And if government or the king comes after your life, you still have this natural right to self-defense that you can exercise. So that was not good for Hobbes, because he was now seen as putting out this traitorous material, right? Because he justified a right to rebel. If the government, the state, threatens your natural right of self-defense, that breaks the contract, because you only, right, join into this society to help protect all that. And the king, of course, didn't see this as a contractual relationship. The king saw this as, I was put here by God to lead this country, and you don't have a say about it. So Hobbes went to France because he wasn't going to defeat the king when they came looking for him, and they branded him a traitor, and so he had to run. So writing this and coming up with this idea kind of ruined his economic perspectives in England for a good long while, until the monarchy changed and he was invited back. But the idea here, right, put this very rational concept of a right to rebel into public discourse. And our founding fathers, right, talk about in their letters to each other and their debates with each other, having read the great natural rights philosophers, right, Hobbes, and we'll talk about Locke in a little bit. So they read all this, they knew all this. And so when they start seeing King George doing things, and King George government doing things that they thought violated their rights as citizens, they had a built-in argument here that, hey, you're violating the contract. Our next step is to rebel against this form of authority that you're trying to use against us, right? So all of this is kind of bubbling out of this historical reading that they have at the time. John Locke comes along a little later, another Englishman, another natural rights philosopher, had read Hobbes, and viewed his work as an extension, although with a very clear and concise difference between himself and Hobbes. Whereas Hobbes was trying to argue how we came to have the government we have at the time, right, in England, and explain the monarchy and explain all that. Locke was going a different direction. He thinks, yes, we have natural rights. We have the rights to self-protection, self-defense. We have the ability to build self-contracts. Rational man will certainly come out and engage in a contractual process. But why would we ever contract to have a monarch? That just doesn't make sense, right? We're not going to go from I'm the king of my own whole life to I'm going to give all that up and let somebody else be king. We would, through our rational discourse, come up with a different idea. And Locke says, and this is where he goes in a different direction than Hobbes entirely, that the social contract, right, that's going to come out of this kind of meeting of the minds between rational individuals is a contract that wants to have a small or limited government whose purpose is constrained. The job of government, whatever kind you put into place, is to protect life, liberty, and property. And that's it. Now, that probably sounds familiar to you, because later on our founding fathers used, right, that same phrase, and they talk about government providing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So a little bit of plagiarism maybe going on here between our founding fathers and Locke, right? But the point being that, right, they had looked at these arguments about what the point of government is and how we bring a government about. And Locke provided them with a very clear roadmap to kind of where they wanted to go, away from a monarchy, which is where Hobbes had ended up, right? And so they start, right, he talks about, and they pick up on this discussion about government being answerable to the people, government being a construction that rational people with natural rights build, contract into an existence to exist, and give it its ability to act, and loan power to that government to get things done. So he says, right, the purpose of government is to protect life, liberty, and property. It's answerable to the people, and there will be limits on the power of government. It cannot expand beyond reason. And two of the limits that he explicitly mentions are standing laws and property rights. In other words, standing laws are laws that are put into place, say, here's how we're going to play the game on this issue or that issue. The government is answerable to those standing laws. It can't just say, no, we're not going to do that. It has to itself be governed and limited by the laws that are in place, which is why constitutions become such a big deal, because a constitution is kind of a construct of standing laws to both create government and limit it. The second limit on government is going to be property rights. And this is a huge, huge issue for Locke, and one that we've kind of incorporated, especially in the United States, that we don't think much about. For Locke, property, things that you owned, whether that's real property or other property, were an extension of your thought, your effort, your work, your goals, who you are as a person, right? You choose how to act and interact in the world. You choose what to create with your work, your effort. And what you create, you've invested literally your life into those things you create. When you make something, you invest yourself into it. And so for Locke, property was an external extension of the life force and the effort and the energy of a person. And the government to come and assault that, or to take that, or to abscond that property away from you is equivalent to attacking you physically. For Locke, the identity of a person was defined by their property, which is why one of the three purposes of government is to preserve property, because that's preserving the individual. Now, this might seem a little odd to us today. It's more ingrained in our society than you might think. Do any of y'all that are there today listening own a vehicle? I was hoping there'd be some, right? Odds are pretty good. And I'm not going to ask you to discuss this right in chat or anything, but I do want you to think about it, right? Think about as you were growing up and how your life changed when you got your first vehicle, your tricycle, a bicycle, skateboards, whatever, something that allowed you to be mobile. Your world expanded because of that piece of property a little bit. You could go further and do more things on your own volition. You think about the first time you got a motorized vehicle, a car, a truck, a motorcycle, something like that. Your world got a whole lot bigger, right? That piece of property, that thing that you owned, that you were using, right, delivers a bigger world to you. It changes who you are. And in a sense, it affects the identity of who you are, right? The most important person in a high school on a Friday or Saturday night is the person who, in your group of friends, has both the car and a full tank of gas, right? Because they're the ones that can take y'all to do things. And so, right? And when that was you, right, that was a big deal, right? It allowed you to escape the reach and control of your parents and get out into the world and make your own decisions and go places and do things. So property, and that doesn't change, right? I'm just using the car as an example. That doesn't change your first house, right? Your next house, your whatever you're doing, right? Your business, your all of these things that people can bring into creation and make and purchase as property affect the identity of who they are. Right? There's a difference between being a roommate in a situation where you're renting property to becoming a owner of property, right? And that changes the perspective of yourself, and it changes perspective of you that other people have of you. And that's what Locke is recognizing here, that property is really important as a part of who we are and how we engage in the world. So for government, right, it has to protect that, to protect the individual. Now, he recognizes that government has to, in some way, right, get taxes, your property, right, to be able to do their job. And it has to be done through some form or fashion of agreement. If they just take it, right, it's an assault on you. If it's through a contractual situation, then you've agreed to it, and hopefully it's going to be, right, take some from everybody, deliver something that's good for everybody, right? But it's done by Locke through explicit consent. In other words, all of us have to get involved and say yes or no, and we figure out how it's going to work based on the rules, whether that consent works or doesn't consent. But it's not something that's assumed. It's not something that just kind of pops up. It's something as an individual, all of us as individuals in that country, in that government, are going to take a part in. We're going to vote on it. We're going to have a say. And if you can't give explicit consent, you think that is an absolute wrong thing. For Locke, your job is to then liquidate your property and go to another government you can work with, that you can live in, right? Because you're going to be there by either consenting or you're going to leave if you can't. And that's what, the explicit consent is deep, right? And so you may not like everything, but if you're there, you've consented to the rules that are in place. And if you don't like those rules that are in place, you need to go somewhere else. So the idea of having a government created by people through their consent means that as rational individuals, we've all opted in. Once that consent is given, if the government goes against the general consent, violates the rights of individuals, that is, just like Hobbs had, a justification for rebellion against that government. The government's overstepped its bounds. It won't fix its bad actions. Those of us that lent our power to this system of government now have the authority to come back and reclaim it and change the government and fix the problem and revolt. So Locke wrote his 2 treatises on government and put this out there. They too were bestsellers. Still under a monarchy, and he too got to go to France after writing his book. Because while they're talking about these big ideas of the rights of man and the consent of the governed and the right to rebel, Hobbes and Locke were both living under monarchs at the time. But our founding fathers, right, a whole ocean away, experiencing these wrongs from their perspective that King George was inflicting on them, thought their rights had been violated, their consent as citizens had been violated, and the major political philosophy that was motivating them told them the resolution to this is revolution, right? To overthrow the government. So Thomas Jefferson is right, one of our founding fathers that takes this philosophy that's coming from England at the time and these national rights philosophers, and he, as the principal writer of the Declaration of Independence, puts this argument in writing, telling the King of England and the government of England what the problems are and why revolution has to happen, and that it's time for a rebellion. And so he makes the argument in the Declaration of Independence, and we'll look at that in just a second. The interesting thing about the Declaration of Independence we're going to write, and this justification for revolution that is there, is that it is ostensibly the first real argument for a conservative revolution, which is odd, a strange thing, right? Revolution of its very nature usually means that everything in a society gets upended. When you have a revolution in your country, you're not just changing governments, you're usually changing social norms and mores and how you act in society and all of the laws and the government, maybe the economic form that you're using, right? All of these things are up in the air and part of the revolution. Our revolution was not a normal revolution. It was as conservative as the revolution as you could have, because all we're doing is trying to change our form of government and not much of anything else. So it's a very limited type of revolution, very conservative, just fixing the problem, not tossing out everything, right? And so this is what Jefferson argues for in the Declaration of Independence. And so here's the intro to the Declaration of Independence. I know it's a little long, a lot of words there, but just listen to them as I read this to you, because one, Jefferson's an incredibly good writer. Two, but you're going to hear Hobbs and Locke in this, right? So Jefferson says, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, right? There's your looking back to the state of nature and the laws, right? Natural law, right? A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that we, in this case, should declare the causes that impel us or them to separation. In other words, we've got problems that have led us to the point of revolution. Let me explain, right? We're not intemperate. We're not crazy people. We're not trying to, right, just throw everything up in the air. We've got some real grievances, and here they are. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, he's going to start off right at the beginning. This is so true, you can't even argue against it. But here it is. First, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Those would be those natural rights that Hobbes and Locke were talking about. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice that's the Lockean phrase there, that was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Interesting choice of words that they choose to substitute happiness for property. And why would they do that? Well, remember back at the beginning of the lecture, I said, hey, all constitutions are written in with bias, and they're written in to play the rules of the game a certain way. Our founders are writing this new constitution that's going to be following this Declaration of Independence. And the one thing they don't want to put into place is a system of rules or laws of governance that are going to deprive them of the property they already have. So you don't want to say that you have an unalienable right to property when 90% of the population are going to be under this new form of government don't have much, if any, property, because you're basically saying, oh, you should come take some of ours. They don't want to say that. They're looking after themselves, right? So among these unalienable rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, right out of Locke, right? The purpose of government. So to secure these rights, the governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Sorry, King George, right? There is no divine right putting you there. It's consent of the people that create a government. And whenever any form of government, notice here, they've switched how we consent to be governed to any form of government. When any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them that shall make seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So there's our list of grievances, right? Our excuse to King George why he's out of touch, and now out of power in the United States, right? That we are going to be independent of this monarch who ignored the natural rights of men and the fact that government is created by them. So it's a really incredible piece of writing that takes these philosophers' thoughts and ideas and puts them into a very practical expose on why government should be different and why we should change and why we should rebel. And this was it, right? So um, that makes sense how all that kind of ties together to lead us over a couple hundred years of thought, basically, to what's going to become our Constitution. All right, so let's look at our Constitution. And we're currently on our second Constitution. Our first Constitution was the Articles of Confederation. It was not a particularly well done piece of political writing, but it served to give us a form of government that was at least arguably workable. So the Articles of Confederation served first to bring the states together as one operating unit. So the Articles of Confederation tells us that the 13 states are going to come together as a unified group of sovereign states to build a national government that will serve to organize and work on their behalf. Now each of these states, right, didn't want any other state to have a monopoly of power or a majority of power, so they were sharing power, each state getting essentially the same amount of political power in the national government, and more importantly, getting veto power over anything that other states would want to do to the national government. It worked, sort of, right? But it had some really, really large problems with it. At the time that we institute the Articles of Confederation, we're in rebellion with England. We're fighting the war, right? And we've got some real problems that the war points out to us under this system. First and foremost, we don't have any way of ensuring that the national military, the Army, right, and Navy have a consistent economic and supply support from all of the states. Right, we're fighting this war was essentially right a nationalized set of officers at the very, very tip top, trying to guide a bunch of state militias that right were being sent by the states to fight on behalf of the country as a whole. And the states wanted to have some say about what their troops were doing. The national government, right, Washington as the general was trying to lead the whole army in a certain way with strategies and tactics to win, and was being hampered by a lot of problems of getting the state governments to work together through this confederation. One of the things that I like to think about when I think about Washington at this period of time is that he's not known as the greatest military genius in the history of warfare. He was very capable, not a bad general at all. But what made him successful and what made the revolution successful was not necessarily his strategic brilliance. He had some, and he had officers that came up with some good plans, and some worked and some didn't. But when you look back at his efforts throughout the Revolutionary War, what stands out is his ability to walk between the members of the government, the national government, between the state leaderships, and get them to agree time and time again to support, right, the war effort. Because the federal government had no authority to tax and raise monies from the states. And so to conduct a good war effort, Washington was having to continually go to state leadership and say, you need to bring me some supplies and some people and some cash from your state, right? And he's doing this all at the same time he's supposed to be organizing the war effort as the leading general. It's a phenomenal piece of history to see him be successful in spite of a form of government that hampered quick decision making that was necessary and required for good warfare at the time. He was obviously, and the army and the states were obviously successful. We got some help from France and a few other players in the world, and England, to our benefit, was focused on a lot of things going on in the world besides just us. And frankly, they figured, okay, this is a problem we can, it's getting a little expensive, it's getting a little drawn out, we'll come back and solve it later. And they kind of almost did in the early 1800s. So the war ends, right? And things in the United States are trying to come to some sense of normalcy. But there are three large problems that are either caused by this first Constitution or can't be solved because of this first Constitution, requiring us to change our Constitution, right, and move away from the Articles of Confederation. The first being that throughout the whole war, our economics in the country were scattershot as far as the policy at best, and fairly non-effective. And we had two classes of people: the debtor class and the creditor class, right? And all economies kind of have this anyway: those that have and those that have not. And right, the debtors go to the creditors to get money to be able to do things they need to do, and then they pay those loans back. And what we had happening at this time was a lot of mainly farmers, and a lot of those farmers had gone off to war and left family behind to run the farms. And the economies were such that a lot of these farms had to go get an extension of credit from the banks to keep their farms afloat, to buy their seed, to buy either crops or animals or whatever the case was, to keep their farms afloat. Right, the young men of the family were off fighting the war, those that were conscripted or volunteered, and they were being paid, and they were being paid in whatever form of cash was available, whether it was from Rhode Island or from Virginia or from South Carolina. Who knows what kind of script you got, whether it was from a state or maybe it was a governmental script that was backed by a state. But the fact is that we had dollars out there that weren't worth anything, that were being paid to debtors, which were the people fighting in the war. And at the end of the war, they come back and are bringing these dollars with them. Some they'd sent back ahead of time, but they're bringing these dollars with them. And the expectation is that they will take this money to the banks, they'll pay off their loans, and they'll have their farms back in their own name and move forward. But the banks and the creditors had a different problem they were trying to deal with, and that's that in their particular states, there was only one form of money that was valid, and that was their states. And that money coming from other states, while it might be somewhat valuable, wouldn't have been as valuable as the money in their state. And if it was coming from the federal government, it might be worth even less. And so the money that the debtors thought they had to pay off their debts to the creditors wasn't being accepted because it wasn't useful. And so these creditors began to go through the court systems, filing the liens against the property, right, and then taking that property as payment for the loan. Now you've been off fighting a war for a few years, and you come back home and this is what you're facing. I don't know, one of the aims of government was supposed to be the preservation of property, and this doesn't look like it. So a group of farmers Massachusetts, led by Edwin Shea. I'm not sure on the first name. Started going to these courthouses armed when these debt cases were being brought before justices, and they were kind of strong arming the results of the justices to be more in favor of the debtor and not the creditor. Well, that's not a good thing for anybody involved. Maybe the individual, the one individual in front of the court that day, but essentially it's introducing a huge economic crisis, huge political legitimacy crisis in the court system, in the banking systems, in the debt and credit systems and contracts of our society. And all of these things that we were trying to kind of manage while we changed our governmental form, we're pushing against it. And our leaders at the time were like, maybe this revolution's not going to turn out as conservative as we wanted. We got to do something. We need to get together, and we need to talk about how we can address these problems at a national level, because these are problems that are between the states a lot of times, and the way different ways the states do things. We need some continuity. So they called together a convention in Annapolis to try to figure out what to do. Out of the 13 states, 5 of the state delegates actually showed up, and that was not a basis for making a good decision. But it did motivate them to try again at a later date. But these 3 things, right, the economic turmoil, the farmers' rebellion that was happening, and the fact that the states couldn't even manage to get themselves together in a big enough group to try to solve the problems, kind of pointed us to the need for a bigger change. We'll stop there.